Today, we've already been through some introductions. Broadly, the structure of the meeting is that we're going to have a quick introduction to natural capital overall and also thinking specifically about this project. I'll review some of the project methods. If we have time, we'll have a little bit of a comfort break. You can stretch your legs, get a glass of water. Then we have a planned activity and discussion, and we'll go through some of we'll summarize the project and go through some potential next steps. Importantly, there's a bit of wiggle room here, and the reason that I've put that in is to allow plenty of time for in-depth discussion today. But if we end up not needing that time, we'll just close the meeting early. We're also going to be using Slido for some of the activities. This has been used in some of the other work package presentations as well, but I will post links in the chat to use that. You can also, if you have questions throughout, please do feel free to ask them. You can raise your hand, you can post them in the chat, or you can submit them via Slido. Any of those options is fine with me. Okay, so the goal of the workshop today is to provide an overview of Work Package 1 of the Darwin Plus project, focusing particularly on the rationale, so why we did it, and the methods that we used. This is going to be followed up with an in-person workshop next week, which will have more of a focus on some of the applications and next steps. So slightly different goals out of each of those workshops. Importantly, I also really want to highlight that this is a knowledge exchange. So what I really hope is that it's not one directional and it's just not me talking at you for an hour and a half or so. There's an enormous amount of collective expertise on this call, and I hope that we will learn from each other today, and particularly what works and what doesn't work, where you see future opportunities or possible applications of this kind of work. So please don't be shy. And to start with that, we'll start with our first Slido. This is to just gauge where people are at with natural capital, and the question is, how confident do you feel about your knowledge of natural capital approaches? So I will post the link in the chat now. Likewise, you can go to slido.com and use that number to go straight into the question today. So give me a shout if that does not seem to be working. Okay, we've got our first vote in. That is good news. All right, and hopefully you can now see this on the screen. All right, people voting has slowed down, so I'll call it there for now. But thanks for participating. What that tells us is that most people would consider themselves to be either on the less confident side or moderately confident with natural capital approaches, but there's also obviously quite a few people on this call as well who know quite a lot already. So I hope that this doesn't rehash too much old ground, but I think it will be nice to have a brief overview and make sure we're all on the same page about some of the terminology that gets used. So we'll go at it from that perspective. Thanks, everyone. All right. So when we're talking about natural capital, what we mean is I suppose a nice definition to use is that it refers to the world's stock of natural assets, which includes everything. So it includes geology, soil, air, water, and all living things. When we're talking about assets, these are usually habitats and species, and that's how we're going to refer to them today. And these habitats and species provide ecosystem services, which are, things that we benefit from in the environment. That can be sort of tourism value and engagement, but also provisioning services such as fisheries. And these services have value. And importantly, this can be monetary value, but it can also be social, cultural, or intrinsic value. There's more than one way to value an asset, so I just want to flag that straight up. And the reason that we like to use natural capital approaches and where we think that they're useful is in ensuring this value is considered when we make decisions about the marine environment. It means that when we're making decisions that are perhaps primarily economically driven, that we have the full picture and all of the knowledge to inform that decision making. Because natural capital is an approach that helps to inform those decisions rather than being a decision making framework in of itself. And they're useful. They're useful for understanding the full range of benefits that we get from healthy and functioning ecosystems, and they help us make sure that the economic value of those ecosystems is properly factored into how we make choices about how we use them. And I like to personally think of this idea of values. So there's monetary value, but also our sort of societal and our cultural values that all weigh into how we make choices about marine assets and how we use the marine environment. And valuation is a really important part of that. So, and a lot of the evidence that we work with can be used to calculate those valuation estimates, which is why it's so important that we have very robust information for making these valuations. But for example, here we're looking at an example of carbon sequestration. So plants store carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it in soils and sediments. And across marine and terrestrial habitats, this is an estimate that FTEC did in one of their 2018 reports for the ecosystem accounts. But the estimates are about 950,000 tons of CO2 estimated per year, which adds up to nearly $31.3 million over a year. And if you take that over a much longer time frame, which is, with some of these ecosystem processes and carbon sequestration being a really great example of that, you do have to take a long-term view. And that quite quickly adds up to enormous amounts of money, perhaps for habitats that aren't immediately obvious as being valuable. Um, and that's why the valuation aspect of this can be very interesting. However, those accurate valuations require a good understanding of extent and the condition of those assets. And this is specifically for thinking about habitats really here. But when I'm talking about extent and condition, I essentially mean how much of an asset is there and is that asset healthy? Monitoring the ecological status of those assets is really important. So understanding how they're doing and whether they're changing over time. And this is what ties into some of the other projects that come under this Darwin Plus work, thinking about condition indicators, so understanding how well habitats are doing, and vulnerability assessments as well. And also another thing to flag is that the condition of an asset is often only partially reflected in the monetary value. So what I mean by that is that when we consider something good condition, it's delivering on a certain set of ecosystem services. That might not be the only thing that is contributing to that value. So in summary, it's often more complicated than is first apparent. But the goal overall is to integrate nature into those decision-making processes. And that brings us on to our next Slido activity, where I'm asking, what are the benefits do we receive from the marine environment? I know that the people on this call will have lots and lots of ideas, but I'm very interested to see which ones emerge particularly. So I will drop the link in the chat again. Otherwise, you can use that Slido number on the screen. And all being well, this will come up as a nice little word cloud that I can share with you all. Hey, look at that. I really love that someone's put joy. All right, thank you, everyone. So there's some really great answers on here. Would anyone like to elaborate on any of them? So some of the main ones that come up are coastal protection, carbon sequestration, fisheries and food. We've also got things around sort of well-being, joy, that's a really nice one, mental health. So there's some of these very tangible and some of them are less tangible, but I'd argue they're all really important. I really like that it's gone beyond just provisioning services, which are sometimes perhaps the easiest to value, and that we're starting to think about some of those things that are very important as well, but also can be really challenging when talking about them from a natural capital point of view. So thank you for sharing those. Okay. Well, some of these services we're going to touch on today, and some of them we won't. That's just the nature of the project and the scope of the project. But I hope that when we move forward with the natural capital approaches, we can include all of these as things to think about. And yeah, would anybody like to comment on this before we move on? All right, totally fine. I get that it's early in the morning for many of you as well. Cool. So with that in mind, those things all fall under ecosystem services, which we're formally defining as the direct and indirect contributions that ecosystems, so our natural capital assets, provide for human well-being and quality of life. So that can, and we tend to categorize these. So we talk about provisioning services, which are things like food, so fisheries usually, but not exclusively. Sand and gravel is another one, for construction, for example, and these are things that directly produce materials that we as humans use. Then there are regulation and maintenance services, and some of these can be quite subtle, but still really, really important. So under that would be um, assets or habitats that provide areas for other species. So this mangroves and coral reefs are both great examples of this. More broadly, nutrient cycling, so the movement of energy and nutrients through an ecosystem, and storm protection being one of those as well, which is perhaps the most tangible of those three. And then finally, cultural services. So that ties into things like health and well-being, cultural connections to a place, and also tourism activities. Um, so when we were thinking about some of the benefits that are provided by the marine environment, I'm also particularly interested in whether or not there are certain habitats that are viewed as more or less important for providing those benefits. So I will once again chuck a link in the chat and we'll do another word cloud. Okay. Um, so I know we've talked about a few of these already, and I think there'll be a few big ones, but I'm also very interested to think about whether there's lesser known habitats and areas that we should be thinking about. And I will put this up. Yeah, mesophotic reefs. Excellent. Okay, so there's just a couple of people still left typing. But I think it's pretty clear that there are a couple of big ones here and then a couple of really interesting other habitats that we could certainly think about in the future. So the big ones are coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrasses. Within that, we've got some more specific aspects, for example, thinking about mesophotic reefs, as well as a couple of other habitats. So people have mentioned pelagic areas and the water column. We've got sand dunes, we've got wetlands, sandy beach areas. Yeah, all really, really great. And also completely different sets of services for some of these. Did anyone have particular services in mind when they mentioned these habitats? Perhaps for some of the smaller ones.
So for seagrass and mangroves, carbon sequestration, habitat for nurseries, fisheries.
Yeah.
And similarly with mesophotic reefs and coral reefs of coastal protection. Yeah, just to name a few.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Paul. Anybody else? That's okay. We'll get into some of them. We have a couple of sets of services to talk about today, but that's by no means all of them. So I think there's perhaps some really interesting conversations to be had about some of the other services we could think about for some of these habitats. So thank you everyone for participating. All right. So that's a broad introduction to natural capital. Beyond that, I want to talk just briefly about, give you an overview of the project. I'm sure you've seen a variation of this slide before, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just in case you haven't. So the Darwin Plus 119 project was a 3-year project. It ran from August 2020 to July this year. And it was a collaborative effort between Turks and Caicos Islands government, the JNCC, SERI, and it was funded by the UK Darwin Plus initiative. The broad goal here was stated as developing technical capacity and evidence to support status assessment and management programs in the Turks and Caicos Islands coastal and marine environments. Doing this specifically by developing technical tools and methods to enhance the evidence base for assessment and management of marine and coastal resources, and providing support and training to use and apply the developed tools and methods through a knowledge exchange program, which these workshops are a part of. Work Package 1 specifically was about developing an asset register. And the stated aim here is about providing practical tools to enhance understanding of natural capital approaches, both for decision makers and local communities. And the objectives under this, which we're going to walk through the methods of today, firstly was to create a natural capital asset register for the marine and coastal environment. This incorporates outputs from previous JNCC, natural capital accounting, and some work done by FTech as well. So that's really great that they're on the call. It all ties in nicely. So we're drawing on tools that have already been developed to produce this piece of work. The second objective was to undertake a systematic literature search to identify links between assets, so marine and coastal habitats and species that are present in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and draw links to the ecosystem services and benefits that are then being provided by those assets. So wherever possible, this literature search was focused in TCI, but also prioritizing other resources from elsewhere in the Caribbean where available. And then finally, the third aim of this work was to develop ecosystem service maps using the Nature Conservancy habitat maps and outputs from the asset register developed in this project for a set of ecosystem services that fall within provisioning, regulation and maintenance, or cultural service categories. And this is a useful overview of natural capital processes and some of the methods. So we start with a baseline habitat map. So what's there and how much of it have you got? We translate this into an asset register, which is essentially a table of what assets or habitats you have, and then how much, so extent, and then ideally condition. And this is a tricky part that we'll get into a bit later. You use these to create a asset service matrix, which combines information on your assets, so your habitats and species, and the services you provide. This is usually a literature review, and essentially it scores the levels of service that you expect to get for different ecosystem services by those assets. And you use these along with your baseline habitat map to produce maps of potential service delivery. And this is sort of the underlying evidence, and then this ties into building physical accounts, which are the quantities of ecosystem services that you're measuring. So this is when it starts to get into the monetary aspect of things, and then translating, so the units of what it is you're trying to measure, and then translating that into the economic value of goods and benefits. Within this project, we worked on this bit. So I know that FTech worked on the physical and monetary accounts for some services, and this complements their work. But to highlight, I am an ecologist, so I will be talking about the red box, and I will leave economists to tell us a little bit more about the physical and monetary accounts another time. And this is the order we did things in. So we start with our baseline habitat map. We move on to our asset register and then our asset service matrix. And finally, producing some ecosystem service maps, which are maps of potential service delivery. So for that baseline habitat map, these were made using data and maps from the Nature Conservancy. I've put the citation for their project below, but this was a remote sensing project. And we used those GIS layers to calculate estimated extent of each habitat for the asset register. And that information is now on the TCI data portal if you'd like to go in and play with it yourselves at some point. And we produce habitat maps that look something like this. So these are the benthic habitats that we started with. So we've got coral and algal habitat, dense and sparse algae on hard bottoms. We've got seagrass, a couple of different kinds of reefs, so reef four crest areas, and then spur and groove reefs, and then backs as well. And then sand, of course, which is quite a nice big chunk, so let's not ignore that. So that's what the habitat maps looks like. You've got current and proposed protected areas as well. And you can use this to make an asset register. So how much of it is there in kilometers squared for each of for the area that you're interested in. And I think what's interesting to note is for the coastal marine area in the Turks and Caicos Islands, seagrass and sand come up as taking up the most of that area. And then we've got some of those other habitats moving down from there. So this is quite interesting. I think there are perhaps interesting questions to explore around the services delivered and the areas which deliver them, and whether those things are proportionate. So perhaps sand habitats deliver more or less services, but actually they take up the most space, and whether there are things that we can think about there for the future. But that's what our asset register looks like. And then this is the interesting bit where we did a bit more research. So we produced asset service matrices from a comprehensive literature review of what evidence was already there. So this included some of the grey literature, it included lots of scientific papers, resources that some of you on this call pointed us towards as well. So what this information is used for is to create what's called an asset service matrix. And an asset service matrix is just a table. It's not particularly complicated, but what it tries to do is link your asset, so your habitat or your species, with the service that is being provided by that asset. So in the example in the image here, I've taken seagrass bed as an example, and then we go away and we look for evidence in the literature. This can be other asset service matrices, it can be published papers, and then we assign a level of confidence to that information and think about how much of that service you're getting. So this is usually categorized because it's currently very difficult to quantify. That's still a very active area of research. But you categorize service delivery, you categorize how confident you are in that information, and then you take all of those linkages for all of the assets that you're interested in to build an asset service matrix. And they look like this. So this is the habitat asset service matrix that was made for this project. So what we've got is we've got our habitats in the rows and then services that we're interested in the columns. Each little box is categorized firstly with level of service delivery. So this is based on what the evidence was telling us about that relationship. So for example, let's see. We know that dense and sparse algal areas were identified in the literature as being really important habitat for queen, and the bold asterisk means that came from studies that were done in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and the 3 means that we have high confidence in that information. So that's what they look like. We also did one for species, which I think is another interesting way to look at this. So you can think about habitats, or specific species are actually more important. You can also do this, you can apply the same method. And that looks a bit like that. So we looked at some specific groups of fish that were important, as well as corals, conch is in there, reef sharks, spiny lobster, and turtles. And interesting and worth highlighting is that there are contributions to quite a few cultural services for many of these species. But what's really useful about these, they firstly give you like a really nice overview of the information. So it's a quick way to understand what some of those relationships are. But also importantly, you can go into the report and you can trace back every single resource that this information came from. So it's a really transparent way for people to understand how decisions were made about perhaps prioritizations and that kind of thing. So I think they're quite a nice way to display the information, and I think quite useful. And so by linking the spatial data from the benthic habitat map that we started with, so linking that with the asset service matrix means it's possible to visualize areas where ecosystem services may be being delivered. So the way this works is it provides, you essentially take where you know there's habitat and where you know that those habitats provide services. So what it does is it provides an assessment for the possibility of ecosystem service delivery. It doesn't necessarily reflect what's actually being delivered, because it doesn't yet account for factors such as the condition of the habitat, or indeed where there's people around to use said resource or said ecosystem service. So what that means is it's a good overview of where services are potentially being delivered. Yeah. So you do this by joining habitat maps to the asset end of your asset service matrix in GIS. And then we use those delivery scores, so 1, 2, or 3, low, medium, high, to show differences in the potential provision of a service. And we did this for a few different services. So we did that for regulating services, specifically carbon storage and erosion and flood protection. For provisioning services, we looked at habitat provision for adult and juvenile grouper. And then for the cultural services, we looked at snorkeling activity. So that's how it all fits together. And in the end, you get these service provision maps. And they look a bit like this. So this is the relative carbon storage potential of shallow marine coastal habitats for the Turks and Caicos Islands. So you can see areas where carbon storage is high, moderate, and low. And that aligns with some of the habitats that we will have seen in the benthic habitat map for that reason. Similarly, we've got relative erosion and flood protection potential. Again, so for example, like we know that coral reefs are really important for protecting against coastal erosion and flood protection. So you've got lots of high areas here. Mangroves are quite important for this, so you often see them quite close to the coastal areas, and seagrasses also have contribute towards taking wave energy out of the system, stabilizing the sediment, and reducing the impact of those storms. So this is a really nice way to visualize where services might be being delivered. Here on this one, we've got the relative habitat provision potential for juvenile grouper at the top and adult grouper at the bottom. And I think this is a really interesting one because as you all know, like species use different habitats at different stages throughout their life history. And so understanding this is actually really important in thinking about how we might protect some of those species or how we might maintain fisheries into the future in terms of thinking about the whole life cycle of a species and perhaps not just protecting the endpoint. So I think they can be a really valuable way to visualize some of those dynamics. And then finally here we've got relative snorkeling activity. And this is I think this is quite a useful one to highlight that thing about it being potential service delivery. So we know from the evidence that snorkeling or snorkelers enjoy specific kinds of habitats. So again, those kinds of habitats get rated as high potential provision for snorkeling activity. But we also know that people are not snorkeling in all of these areas, right? So it's just where the habitat is and therefore where the service could potentially be delivered. What you would then need to do is come in from the other end and perhaps talk to people who are engaging in that activity to understand where the service is actually being delivered as well, and where those two things overlap. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Oh, I can see someone. Yes, the map will be made public. Yeah, they should be. They're all in the report that that has been handed over, will get handed over. So yes, that information will all be available, and the habitat maps are on the TCI data portal as well. So, given the information that we've covered, I'm hoping that we can have a little bit of a discussion. I'd be interested firstly in these first two sets of questions. So what would you expect to see if the extent of a habitat increased or decreased? And then what you would expect if that habitat became degraded? And we can talk through some specific examples as well. Rebecca, I can see you still have your hand up.
Sorry, I'm not sure how to take it off. It was just a
That's okay. Do you have any thoughts on the questions?
Well, if a habitat would to increase or decrease, I guess we could see changes in the amount of services it can, you know, its potential. If it's like a habitat for the grouper and it increases, maybe we could see a higher population of that species. And if it decreases, then the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great example as well. One thing that I think would be perhaps interesting to explore is what the shape of that relationship is. So would we expect a linear increase in service delivery with a linear increase in habitat extent? Or similarly, would you expect a slow decline in habitat extent, or would there perhaps be tipping points or thresholds for certain kinds of habitats?
I guess it could depend on the service. If it'd be storm protection, I think it'd be pretty more linear. But if it has to do with a species, then yes, probably threshold or a delay in the response.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly. No, thank you very much. Would anybody else like to discuss any specific examples or have any thoughts on that? All right, that's okay. So those are questions that we increasingly want to answer as part of natural capital approaches, and particularly that idea of whether there are thresholds or tipping points that we need to be concerned with when we're thinking about service delivery and whether or not we want to continue to see those services being delivered. So that's a very active area of research, and hopefully in the not too distant future we'll have a better handle on some of those relationships. But I think it's a really interesting question to explore and a really important one to be aware of, so that we don't just assume that those relationships will be linear or entirely predictable. What about how we keep track of this information? And whether do you think there are any risks or things that we need to be concerned about if we actually don't have accurate or up-to-date information to inform our understanding of ecosystem services? Would anybody like to elaborate on that? Yes, Rebecca.
That kind of made me think about like the queen conch that we have here. The species that is, for food, it's highly well fished and used and very good. But I think that keeping track of its habitat and things like that would be something very important, so we're not misguided by how much we think there are still out there, and people don't have the wrong information. Just because there's more people fishing it doesn't mean that there's still as many as there was.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I guess because if fishing effort increases, that doesn't necessarily reflect how much of it there is, right?
Yeah. And maybe with the, those kind of map and habitat for the services it provides for them, then it gives us an idea. And even if we don't have to, survey them exactly, it can give us an idea before it.
Yeah. Oh no, thanks. That's a really nice example. Do you think that like longer term monitoring or time series information would help with that as well, that you could see like what directions trends were going in?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I think that would be, yeah, for sure.
Cool. And Victoria's just posted in the chat as well, which leads into like the really interesting next part of this question, which is she says, by not keeping the information up to date, policymakers and researchers would be losing out on key data changes over time. And that's absolutely right. Ultimately, the goal with this kind of work is to use it to support and to inform decision making. And so if that information becomes increasingly out of date or is not as accurate as we'd like it to be in the first place, and that has implications for the choices we make in terms of management and conservation. And she's elaborated with keeping track requires political will and human capacity. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And both of those are challenging in different ways. Yep, thank you, Adam. So if the resources are there, national monitoring programs can help keep track of the habitat and species information. I'm curious, do you feel that this is already happening for particular species or habitats or particular services?
Was that question to me, Louise?
To anybody, actually.
No, yeah, I was just going to say, I guess the monitoring wise is very specific to an area or to a nation, I guess, based on the resources they have, or the political will of that nation. So yeah, it the national monitoring programs are, it depends where you are, doesn't it? Yeah, but it'd be interesting to hear.
It also depends Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, it'd be interesting to hear how that is for TCI. Yeah.
I suppose it also depends what you're monitoring and how you monitor it. There are cheap ways to monitor things, and some habitats are very difficult to get to and difficult to monitor. So if you're looking at seagrasses, you might use LiDAR or satellite imagery or something. Similarly with mangroves, but traipsing around in a mangrove forest and doing it that way is really expensive.
Yeah, I've done it. It's hard work. Yeah, so this ties into wider discussions that are kind of beyond today, perhaps, but worth thinking about and worth bearing in mind is questions around what do we monitor and why do we monitor it? You know, what is perceived to be, because obviously you can't count everything, right? So what choices are there to be made about what we collectively monitor, and how do we do it, and how do we then use that information, and what level of confidence do we have in that information as well? They're all things to bear in mind when using this kind of evidence. Okay, any last thoughts on that? Right, I will move on then. So I have two different maps here. Both of them are produced as part of this project. Both of them have some very similar information on them and some slightly different information. So I essentially want to play spot the difference, and if you could tell me what some of the differences between these maps are. You can put things in the chat as well if you'd rather not speak. That's totally fine. Yeah. Adam has put MPAs. He's absolutely right. One of these has the MPAs mapped and one does not. Anything else?
It's a bit more defined. You can see hard bottom algae on the left, left map. No, sorry,
Yeah.
the right map has a hard bottom algae, but the right map goes a little bit further and says it's dense and sparse. So there's that. So you
Yeah,
got the density there.
It's a little bit more specific, isn't it? There's also a bonus habitat in the second or the right-hand side map.
Mangroves?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so this map has mangroves on it. And the reason that this happened was just the way the project developed, and there was additional data a little bit later on, so we were able to include them. But what does that mean? What does that mean when you suddenly can include a whole additional habitat in how you're thinking about ecosystem services and also what's there? What are some of the implications of that? Well, I can think of two things, and I'm sure there are others, so please do jump in. But firstly, I think adding mangroves means that we're going to have a more nuanced understanding of the ecosystem services that are being delivered. So there may be services now that are relevant that we hadn't previously considered. And importantly, it's going to give us some more nuanced and some slightly more accurate estimates of levels of carbon sequestration, because we started out with seagrass and algal beds and sand, sort of sediment areas, and looking at corals. And then once you have mangroves as well, that sort of reshapes how you're thinking about that ecosystem service. And yes, on that point, Victoria's posted in the chat that one implication is that you can see with greater clarity the complexity of habitats within the same space. That's absolutely true. So ultimately, we just have more information, and that's really useful and interesting to work with. And what you can do with that is, I think we can do with all of these habitats, is, but we can look specifically at the services provided by the mangroves and then map these in a slightly different way. So for this, this is another potential service delivery map. But this gives us a slightly different view of carbon storage. So we know that we know from the evidence that seagrass beds are great for it. but that actually mangroves are even better. And this ecosystem service map with that mangrove information reflects that difference. So that's kind of one of the interesting things with these maps giving you a relative idea of levels of a service, is that if you can then update that with slightly different habitat information, then your understanding of those services change. Does that make sense? I hope so. We can address it in questions if it doesn't, but similarly, so for this map, we've mapped erosion and flood protection. So once again, this includes the mangrove data, and mangroves and coral reefs are really great for providing most of this services. So seagrass do play a role, but when you're talking about taking large amounts of wave energy out of a system, it's really mangroves and coral reefs that are the heavy hitters here. And then so you can kind of see that in this map quite dramatically, which I think is quite interesting. And that's something to be aware of when we're looking at these relative service delivery scales. And again, they're really useful for providing an overview and thinking about where services might be being delivered. But again, they're gonna very much depend on what you're looking at in the first place. And so it's useful to be able to approach these kinds of maps with a critical eye as well. All right. So let's talk about seagrass for a minute. I love seagrass, it's great. And I also love the behavior that's being shown in this photo with those two species, because you might have seen it on when you've been snorkeling or diving perhaps, but fish, so this jack is following the stingray around and essentially scavenging on whatever the stingray feeds on. And I find that always quite a nice thing to see when you're in the water. But anyway, so seagrass beds make up 37% of the study area. They were categorized based on the literature review as having medium service provision for carbon storage, high provision for erosion and flood protection, and again, high habitat provision for juvenile grouper species. And this information helps to improve our understanding of the importance of seagrass habitat from different perspectives. And what I mean by that is perhaps depending on what services are most important to different individuals, some of these will be viewed as more important than others. And this in of itself can add value to decision-making processes when you're thinking about this specific seabed asset. Another thing to think about is condition, which is why I've just got that word with a question mark at the bottom. But currently this method classes all seagrass as more or less the same. It goes into dense and sparse seagrass, but we know that that's very unlikely to be realistic, right? It's seagrass beds can be quite homogeneous, and there will be a lot of variation in terms of the bed density and other aspects of condition. And therefore, that's another thing where continuous monitoring to understand condition can be a really useful piece of the puzzle for understanding these services in more detail. And Laura Pettit's presentation last week did a really deep dive on this, so I'm not going to go into it again, but you can watch that recording if you want to understand a little bit more about how we might develop condition indicators for this kind of work. All right, and then in terms of applications, so where might we use this sort of thing? This kind of information ties into the ecosystem accounting, for example, the work done by FTech. It's relevant to marine spatial planning as well. So we know that so for example, if we take the Blue Belt program, last time I was in the Turks and Caicos Islands, Blue Belt were there as well, so we got to listen to some of their presentations, which was really interesting. And that program is primarily concerned with where activities should take place, right? And it's concerned with how well the planning process works. But ultimately, you still need the underlying ecological and environmental information, firstly, to set priorities in an informed way. So understanding where habitats are that provide particularly important services and how you might prioritize those. And secondly, to understand the impacts of potential planning from so understanding the potential impacts of planning on specific ecosystem services. So that can be anything from where you put your MPA and what that might mean for ecosystem services to where you're creating usage zones for specific tourism activities and what the impacts on services might be then. Because let's take the tourism example. If if you theoretically designate an area for tourism activities, then you increase one ecosystem services, but there may be trade-offs as well. So having this kind of information can really help make informed decisions there. And then another important application is conservation. So thinking about which areas are most important to us, which areas are most important on a, perhaps thinking about conservation at a local scale, but also region-wide as well. Thinking about which areas are most vulnerable, so tying back to those vulnerability assessments. And also prioritizing, you know, how do we maximize what we want to protect? What is most important to us? And that can vary enormously. And these kinds of approaches can help to tease out that discussion. But importantly, with all of these things, natural capital approaches must remain responsive to new data and new evidence as well. And somebody's posted in the chat, Dudley, as well. So could it be used for data gap analysis? Absolutely, it's a great way to identify what services you have no information on. So yes, thank you. That's another really, really excellent example of future applications of this kind of work. And okay. So we're almost there. I won't ask you to do too much more talking, but I really do appreciate everybody that's participated so far. In summary, this project used existing evidence to produce an asset register, asset service matrices, and ecosystem service delivery maps for marine habitats in the Turks and Caicos Islands. These outputs are designed to support decision makers and stakeholders working in policy management and development, as well as providing a baseline for future work on natural capital. Importantly, the outputs are dependent on high quality underlying data, and also importantly, it's totally possible to update these and incorporate new information as it emerges. And that's something we'd really encourage. And yeah, thinking about next steps. So I'd love to know what you all think some useful next steps would be as well. I think there's something to be considered around perhaps thinking about updated and properly ground truthed mapping data. So this was remote sensing data from a regional project that was quite a few years ago now. And this could certainly be updated. I imagine things have changed slightly, and also that we have a better understanding of what some of those habitats might be, so applying some of those new methods. That question of how habitat condition mediates ecosystem service delivery, that's a really tricky one the world over, but I think one that's really worth exploring. An example of that might be thinking about the level of storm protection conferred by a healthy versus a degraded coral reef and what that might look like. There are also other ecosystem services to think about. So if we go back to that word cloud that we made at the beginning, there were loads and loads of services on there that we have just not discussed today because we picked out 4 potential options and have just talked about those. So this work could be done for many other services as well. And similarly, thinking about services provided by assemblages of species and not just the habitats. So going back to that coral reef example, a coral reef that's dominated by fast-growing, branching acropora species is much better at taking, or much better at providing that storm protection as a service than a coral reef that is dominated by encrusting and boulder species that are much more in line with like the reef matrix, so they provide a lot less structural complexity. And then finally, that question going of where there is actually uptake of services. So there may be scenarios and things to think about where a service is being provided, but that it's not necessarily being used, and where do those things overlap, and what can that tell us about planning in the future? Okay. And so we're coming to almost the end of activities, but I'd really love to know what you would like to see next for natural capital in the Turks and Caicos Islands. And I'll put one more Slido link in the chat. Actually, that's a lie. There will be another one after this. So this is your penultimate Slido link. I'll put this on here so you can all see it. I appreciate this is a very big question, so I appreciate you trying to condense it into just a couple of words. Ooh, some really interesting ones. Ah, great. Thank you, everybody. So on here we've got some things around improving the mapping capability, also collecting information for things that we've perhaps not talked about very much today. So for example, wetlands, getting that ground truthing done. We've also got stuff around time series and monitoring change. We've got smart monitoring. I must confess, can somebody elaborate on the acronym? It's
Yeah, it was just cost
specific.
effective and efficient,
Yeah.
because monitoring can be convoluted, expensive, difficult.
Yes.
So developing, yeah.
Yep. Okay. Perfect. That makes sense. And then we've got carrying capacity versus benefits. Would somebody like to tell us a bit more about that?
I was referring to, I guess, the to what extent does the carrying capacity define the amount of benefits that can come from that ecosystem and the natural capital? You know, we might have a high natural capital, but if it's being overused, then saying it has a high natural capital isn't actually accurate.
Yeah. Oh no, that's so interesting. Thank you very much for raising that. That's definitely something that needs to be better incorporated into how we think about natural capital approaches for sure. We've got some things about perhaps using habitat or projections of change in certain habitats. We've got annual reviews. So does that just mean annual updating of perhaps your asset register and that kind of thing? Is that what that person meant? It's okay. And then we've another one I was hoping that somebody could elaborate on was the improved local data and science, and what that means. Is that in terms of like resource for doing this kind of work, or? Yes, thanks. All right, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. That's really, really useful. There's some really interesting stuff in there. I think it's going to be a really interesting area of work for quite a long time to come. I'm excited to see what happens with it. So yeah, thanks. All right, and with that, we're almost there. I just wanted to point you towards some resources. So there was an introductory session a few weeks ago that was recorded, as well as recordings for the presentations and knowledge exchanges around vulnerability assessments and condition indicators. So those will all be made available, and you can absolutely go back and have a look at those. Similarly, this has been recorded, and I can share slides if that would be useful. The reports and maps are all available as well. I will need to talk to DECR about how exactly that works, but you'll be able to read those in more detail and go back to some of the evidence that we've used, which I hope that some of you will find interesting. I also want to flag that I'm going to be around next week in person, which is incredibly exciting. But there'll be in-person workshops at DECR that some of you hopefully are aware of already, and there is a nature school event on the Thursday the 29th from 5:30 to 6:30 as well. And at this stage, does anybody have any final questions and comments? You can also drop things in the chat as and when they occur to you. If you need a few minutes to digest and have a think, that's totally fine. Yes, I'm looking forward to seeing you too. I'll drop you an email. But it would be good to catch up with some of you and also meet some new faces. And yeah, okay. So final Slido link. I absolutely promise this time. But I would just like to go back to that original question, which was, now that we've had this discussion, how confident do you feel about your knowledge of natural capital approaches? And there is a link incoming. There we go. Ooh, we've got some people very confident. That's great. Right. Cool. That's it. People responded. Thank you. So I think that's a general shift up the scale. So thanks very much. That's really good to know. If any questions or things that you'd like to clarify come up, then you can absolutely get in touch and we'll talk through them. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you so much for making the time to come and participate in this today. It's been really, really interesting. And yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks again. This is the citation for the report if you do want to go and look at it. But yeah, thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Louise.
I'll hang around for a few minutes in case anyone has any questions.
Bye. Thanks very much, Louise.
Thanks, Paul.
Speak to you soon.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, Louise. Bye, everyone.